Who was P. F. Strawson?
Sir Peter Frederick, P. F. Strawson, 1919–2006, was educated at Oxford University, where he became a professor in 1968. He disagreed with Bertrand Russell's 18721970 theory of definite descriptions because the statement "the King of France is bald" presupposes the truth of there exists a King of France. This created problems because if there is no King of France, then the King of France is bald. Is neither true nor false, or it is not a statement. Although Strawson was strongly influenced by ordinary language philosophy, he was less interested in linguistic usage than in implied conceptual systems and categories of existence in ordinary reality. In The Bounds of Sense, 1966, he argues for a manifest image, or common, shared, way of understanding the world.
Did Malebranche lead an exciting life?
If he did, it was in his inner life. To all outward appearances, Nicolas Malebranche was a scholar with the temperament of a religious recluse. He was born and died in Paris and throughout his life liked solitude. Malebranche was sickly as a child, born with a deformed spine and prone to respiratory problems. He was educated at home by a tutor until the age of 16. His father, Nicolas, was a royal councillor who managed the finances of 5 farms. His mother was sister to the Viceroy of Canada. Malebranche entered the Collège de la Marche of the University of Paris, receiving an MA in 2 years. After which he studied theology at the Sorbonne in Paris for another 3 years. He was ordained as a priest in 1665 at Faubourg Saint-Jacques. His family contributed to his support by the church, and he had no official duties beyond teaching mathematics in 1674. In 1690 the Church put his Traité de la nature et de la grâce, 1680, on the index of books that Catholics were forbidden by the Church to read because his claim that all of our ideas are in God was controversial, and because he'd been successful in spreading René Descartes, 1596–1650, mathematics. Descartes' writings were on the Church's index of forbidden books. So Catholics were forbidden to read them and they could not be taught in church schools. Although his most important work, The Search After Truth, 1674, won him wide acclaim, his students, such as Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, were considered of greater ability. Malebranche encouraged their research. In 1871, Alexander Campbell Fraser, a biographer of philosophers, wrote this account of how the young philosopher George Berkeley, 1685–1783, was the occasional cause of the death of Malebranche. Berkeley found the ingenious Father Malebranche in a cell, cooking. In a small pipkin, an earthenware cooking pot that was positioned directly over a flame. a medicine for a disorder with which he was then troubled, an inflammation on the lungs. The conversation naturally turned on George Berkeley's 1685 to 1783 system, of which he had received some knowledge from a translation just published. But the issue of the debate proved tragic to poor Malebranche. In the heat of the disputation, he raised his voice so high, and gave way so freely to the natural impetuosity of a man of parts and a Frenchman, that he brought on himself a violent increase of his disorder, which carried him off a few days after.
How did Peter Kropotkin come to form his life philosophy?
Kropotkin's father was a general, and Kropotkin was educated in the Corps of Pages, becoming an attendant to Tsar Alexander II. He received a commission in the mounted Cossacks of the Amur and went to Siberia, where he investigated the penal system. What he saw turned him against the repressive form of government in place. In his 20s, Kropotkin led expeditions into unchanged arid areas of Siberia, which resulted in discoveries about glaciation, the deserts of Eastern Asia, and mountain structure. He read Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's 1809–1865 writings, which led him to resign his commission in protest of an execution of Polish prisoners, who had attempted to escape. After exploring the eskers of Finland, he was offered the position of Secretary of the Russian Geological Society in 1872. But instead went to Switzerland to meet exiled radicals. Kropotkin decided he was an anarchist after moving interactions with Bakunin's followers among the watchmakers of Jura. The watchmakers were conscientious craftsmen who were not part of the wider industrial revolution, and their cooperation in a close-knit community inspired Kropotkin. When he returned to Russia, he joined the underground, and in 1874 was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress. He escaped to Europe, where he founded the journal Le Revolt in 1879 and participated in the London International Anarchist Congress in 1881. In Lyons, France, in 1882, he was sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment for being a member of the International Workingmen's Association, but public outcry led to an early release. After that, he went to England and remained there, returning to Russia after the Russian Revolution of 1917. When Kropotkin lived in England, he worked mainly as a scholar. Leading scientific journals and publishers printed his work. His most important publications were Memoirs of a Revolutionist, 1899, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, 1902, and Modern Science and Anarchism, 1912. His last work, Ethics, was published in 1924 after he died in Russia. Kropotkin's final years were disappointing to him because the aftermath of the Russian Revolution defied his anarchist ideals. He denounced the Bolshevik reign of terror after the October Revolution.
What was Immanuel Kant's theory of the self?
Kant distinguished between the empirical ego and the transcendental ego. The empirical ego is what we normally think of as the self and are able to experience. The transcendental ego is the necessary origin of those fundamental structures of thought and intuition that are necessary for experience. The transcendental ego is known only as an object of thought, and not as an object of direct experience.
What was philosophically significant about 19th-century psychology and social theory?
In the 19th century, the foundations were laid for psychology and sociology to develop as distinct fields separate from philosophy. The reasons for their separation are differences in subject matter as well as methodology. Concerning the latter, Wilhelm Dilthey, 1833–1911, put the case of his age best in claiming that human sciences such as history, psychology, philology, and philosophy were characterized by a need to understand, whereas the physical sciences sought causes. However, in the 20th century, quantitative methodology and experiments in search of causes were to characterize important parts of both psychology and sociology. Quantification and causal explanation were also to characterize economics, which did not become distinctly independent from political philosophy, sociology, and philosophy until the 20th century. But in the 19th century, the establishment of psychology and sociology as separate from epistemology, ethics, and political philosophy, as well as revolutionary critique, was a major achievement.
What is the they?
Martin Heidegger's term the they was meant to refer to ordinary people who go about their everyday lives with no philosophical awareness of their existence.
Who were the right and left Hegelians?
Active interest in Friedrich Hegel's ideas died out soon after his death in 1843. But his influence has nonetheless continued in much 20th century thought. His ideas were immediately interpreted by the right Hegelians, who believed that the Prussian state represented the final union of philosophy and Christianity, and the left Hegelians, including Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach, 1804–1872, and Karl Marx, 1818–1883, who interpreted a politically revolutionary future for the dialectic propounded by Hegel.
Did women object to this negative view of them in the 17th century?
It is difficult to see how they had much opportunity to object. before and after Oliver Cromwell's rise to power in England. Pubic entertainment and behavior were often bawdy. By the time King William III ascended the throne in 1688, Puritanism dominated public morals, especially among the middle class. For some women, such as the successful playwright Alfra Ben, this was not good news. She wrote, "Though I the wondrous change deplore / that makes me useful and forlorn." But even during the wild times of the Tory Restoration, when sexuality was freely discussed and written about, and sexual relationships and desires were acknowledged as natural and tolerated in respectable society, Ben's explicit poetry and plays had rarely gone beyond the conventional wisdom that women were the dangerous sex. In her poem The Disappointment she relates Lysander's impotence. When he is in the presence of the extremely desirable Chloris. Chloris flees, blushing with disdain and shame, and Lysander curses the shepherdess charm / whose soft bewitching influence / had damned him to the hell of impotence.
What are some of John Stuart Mill's influential publications?
In his System of Logic, 1843, Mill added to formal logic a system of evidentiary proof to show how conclusions about matters of fact were justified. He also updated Francis Bacon's, 1561–1626, analysis of causation, and built on David Hume's 1711–1776, theory that causes are not logically connected to their effects, and that causal relationships are no more than constant conjunctions of types of events. In Principles of Political Economy, 1848, Mill identified a gap between what was measured in economics and human values, such as the preservation of the environment and limited population. He argued that the ideal economy would be made up of worker-owned cooperatives. Mill's On Liberty, 1859, was his most contested work because it was an attack on the leveling effects of social opinion. Mill thought that democratic societies imposed conventions on their members that did not allow for much individual experimentation in lifestyles. His more conservative contemporaries objected to the freedoms of opinion he championed, as well as his idea that if what others consider a vice does not harm them, they have no right to interfere with an individual who practices it. His utilitarianism, 1861, argued for the greatest good for the greatest number of people, in which the greatest good is defined as happiness. His On the Subjection of Women, 1869, has endured as a classic feminist work. His last major work, 3 Essays on Religion, 1874, was a rational perspective on religion, but was neither agnostic nor atheistic. Mill reasoned that there probably was a God, but that the amount of human suffering in the world made it unlikely that God was very benevolent toward human beings.
What are some of the main themes in philosophy of biology?
Philosophers of biology are interested in how biological explanations differ in form from explanations in the other sciences regarding whether the behavior of living things can be predicted, and in how environment, genetics, and processes of development interact to result in organisms. They are also interested in evolutionary theory. Useful texts in philosophy of biology include Alexander Rosenberg, Structure of Biological Science. 1985, Elliot Sober, The Nature of Selection, 1984, and Michael Ruse, Philosophy of Biology, 1973. Most contemporary philosophers of biology rely on Ernst Mayer's The Growth of Biological Thought. Diversity, Evolution, and Inheritance. 1982, and Towards a New Philosophy of Biology, Observations of an Evolutionist, 1988. Additional thought by biologists have also resulted in new perspectives on biology that include work by Patrick Bateson, Richard Dawkins, Jared Diamond, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, John Maynard Smith, and Edward O. Wilson. Also, evolutionary biology has inspired new philosophical systems of thought, for example, by Daniel Dennett.
What was the Frankfurt School?
The Frankfurt School was the intellectual activity associated with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. The institute was made possible by a gift from Felix Weil. 1898 to 1975, in 1923, following the first Marxist week, which was very well received by intellectuals. The institute was, in addition, funded by Frankfurt University and, during the Nazi period, 1933 to 1944. Max Horkheimer, 1895 to 1973, and Theodor Adorno, 1903 to 1969, secured the support of Columbia University to set up its exiled version as the International Institute of Social Research in New York City. The institute in Frankfurt was reinstated after World War II ended in 1945. Walter Benjamin, 1892 to 1940. Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979, and Erich Fromm, 1900-1980, were also among its first generation of members. Jürgen Habermas, 1923, remains its most famous contemporary member. Hannah Arendt, 1906 to 1975, had political interests that implied she had more in common with the Frankfurt School than any other movement. Despite striking out on her own as an American philosopher after leaving Germany. Although not part of the Frankfurt School because he was imprisoned by the Italian fascist government in 1926, the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci, 1891 to 1937, deserves mention in this context.
What was Hume's problem of induction?
Hume introduced an enormous problem with how we reason from past or present to the future that still plagues philosophers of science and epistemologists today. He pointed out that no matter how comprehensive our past experience, it is never a logical contradiction to deny that the same thing which happened in the past will happen in the future. Take the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow. Although we have always known it to rise every day, it is not a contradiction to say it won't rise tomorrow. If one objects that past experience gives us regularities between events, like those that occur today and the sun rising thereafter, Hume's response would be that we do not know that those regularities will occur in the future. To take another example, oxygen, friction, and combustible material have always resulted in fire. But maybe in the future that very combination will not be followed by fire. Hume's problem of induction goes beyond saying that we never know enough to predict the future. His claim is that even when we do know enough to predict the future, where that knowledge has been proven in past experience, we do not know that the patterns of our experience in the future will resemble the patterns of the past. Of course, he did not disregard probability or prudence. His attack was on the notion that we can be certain about the future.
How does Plato define a just city in his Republic?
In the Republic, Plato's theory of forms reaches its full development as he presents a, to him, utopian way of life. In order to understand justice in the individual, he sets out to describe a just city, the individual writ large. The main political principle of justice is a kind of division of labor that is mirrored in the tripart division of the human being, or soul, into body, emotions, and spirit, and reason. For Plato, what we experience as the body belonged to the realm of mere appearance. Just as human beings are happiest when their reason rules, it is necessary that the ideal city be ruled by those in whom reason is most perfect, namely, philosopher kings and queens. Below the rulers are a guardian class of police and soldiers, who correspond to the spirited part of an individual soul, and at the bottom are the mechanics, servants and farmers, who are like the appetites, or an individual's physical body. To ensure that the rulers love and serve their city above all else, Plato suggests that the family be abolished. In his social structure, men and women do not have to base their lives on their biological reproductive roles. Private property is unnecessary, too, as are monogamous sexual relationships or traditional marriage. The smartest, healthiest, and altogether best boys and girls will be specially trained. Beginning with a simple diet, plain living conditions, and exercise in the open air. Because the poets lie and teach impiety, there will be no literature in the new curriculum. In young adulthood, the young rulers will be taught mathematics and philosophy. At the age of 35, they will be sent out into the world for 15 years. to serve the community as lower administrators, police, and soldiers. At the age of 50, they will be ready to rule, all the more so because it will be against their desire to devote the rest of their lives to study of the forms. Plato, like many since him, believed that those who do not wish to rule are the very ones who should rule.
What were some of the rather humorous experiments carried out by members of the British Royal Society?
The former British comedy troupe Monty Python would have had a field day with some of the early investigations conducted by the Royal Society. And King Charles II, who was very interested in experiments in general, loved to make fun of the more preposterous ones. For example, at the Philosophical Society of Oxford hosted by founding Royal Society Secretary John Wilkins, 1614 to 1672, who had written about the admirable contrivances of natural things in mathematical marvels there were, among Wilkins' own collection, transparent apiaries and a hollow statue that spoke through a concealed pipe. Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, was considered eccentric because he doctored himself and seemed to make a hobby of collecting medical prescriptions. By the time the Royal Society had formed, alchemy had switched from being a science seeking to convert base metals into gold to one with an aim of using new medical discoveries to prolong human life. Nonetheless, in 1689 Boyle worked successfully to get Henry IV's law against multiplying gold repealed. When Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle upon Tyne, 1623 to 1673, was granted a visit to the Royal Society in 1667, she was shown experiments involving colors, the mixing of cold liquids, dissolving meat in oil of vitriol, weighing air, the flattening of marbles, magnetism, and a good microscope. The Duchess wrote in her own diary that the new science was useless for solving social and spiritual problems.
What were Alcmaeon's innovations in medicine?
Alcmaeon, c. 500 BCE provided new answers to the question, what is health? He explained health as isonomia, or physical equilibrium. This equilibrium was a balance of opposites, which can't be restored indefinitely. Therefore, all living things die.
What is early modern philosophy?
Early modern philosophy is mainly centered on intellectual activity in the 17th century, with some overlap into the early 18th and late 16th centuries. Early modern philosophy was modern in its concerns with epistemology, or the nature and justification of human knowledge. the fact that the scientific revolution was by then taken for granted, and a new acceptance of logical argument and fact-based reasons as necessary ingredients for the practice of philosophy. However, what made it early modern was the continued importance of religious issues. The background social need for philosophers to assert a belief in God, the continued reaction against Aristotelian scholasticism, and the unstable political context prior to the existence of strong nation-states.
More's common sense philosophy.
More made a distinction between what philosophers claim and what ordinary people believe. He wrote, "I do not think that the world or the sciences would ever have suggested to me any philosophical problems. What has suggested philosophical problems to me is things which other philosophers have said about the world or the sciences." His own philosophical approach was to analyze concepts or the meanings of words by determining the difference between any one concept before the mind or under consideration as an object of thought, and other concepts. In his writing, More demonstrated a methodical and thorough style of analysis. It was this calm, painstaking clarity that established his philosophical stature in the 20th century. How did G.E.
Why did philosophers become interested in mathematics, geometry, and logic during the 19th century?
Philosophers have always been interested in these subjects. But in the 19th century there were even more innovations in science and technology than before. Changes in the world had an invigorating effect on higher learning, and philosophers took an interest in new research in the sciences and mathematics. Logic had been a philosophical subject since Aristotle, so new forms of logic were of interest to many philosophers who were not logicians.
How did René Descartes' philosophical work begin?
On November 10, 1619, Descartes spent many hours sequestered in a room-sized stove in a town in southern Germany. Such very large stoves with shelves, places to sleep, and room to stand up in them were built in Germany and Russia, until the end of the 19th century. Descartes had an epiphany as the result of 3 bizarre dreams, which set him on a course to create a new system for science and philosophy. His inspiration was that, beginning with a few ideas known to be absolutely true, and careful methods of reasoning with them, the basic principles of all of the sciences could be logically derived from those ideas. Descartes would go on to live briefly in Paris in 1628, before moving to Holland, where he was to remain for the rest of his life.
What is the auto icon?
Jeremy Bentham founded University College in London and bequeathed to it something called the auto-icon, which contains his own embalmed body. After his death in 1832, the philosopher had his remains preserved and put on display in this large cabinet. It is said that the college council depends on Bentham to resolve tied votes. A rumor the council denies utterly. The head on display in the auto-icon is bogus, however, as the original head was stored more securely elsewhere after it was damaged by student pranksters.
Who was Jean-François Lyotard?
Jean-François Lyotard, 1924 to 1998, was educated at the Sorbonne and attended Jacques Lacan's 1901 to 1981 psychoanalytic seminars. His The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge, 1979, which was commissioned by the Quebec government, won him worldwide fame, and he taught and lectured widely throughout the United States. Lyotard sought to articulate the principles of postmodernism as both an intellectual attitude and a condition of contemporary life.
What general philosophical problems does environmentalism pose?
In more traditional philosophical terms, there are ontological and metaphysical issues involved in what counts as a unit in environmentalism. It is important to define the unit because that defines the subject matter theoretically, and makes it possible to keep track of what should be preserved, in practical terms.
Was Alexius Meinong serious about non-existent objects?
Yes, and it cost his reputation dearly, because Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, was to make great fun of him for it in his famous article on denoting, 1905. Still, other 20th-century philosophers, such as Terence Parsons, 1939, and Roderick Chisholm, 1916 to 1999, were to defend the consistency of Meinong's ontology and the usefulness of being able to talk about non-existent objects. Meinong believed that non-existent objects include the merely possible, as well as the impossible. He thought that existence was just a property of objects, like smell or shape. So that, for example, fictional characters lacked that property, while Meinong himself had it.
Who was G. E. Moore?
George Edward Moore, 1873 to 1958, successfully revived epistemological and metaphysical realism and supported a common-sense philosophical method. He spent most of his career at Cambridge University. becoming a professor there in 1925. As an undergraduate, More was a member of the Cambridge Apostles, a select intellectual group of Cambridge University undergraduates. He was editor of the top analytic journal, Mind, 1921 to 1947. More's main books are Philosophical Studies, 1922, Principia Ethica, 1903, and Some Main Problems of Philosophy, 1953. What was G.E.?
Was Kierkegaard cursed?
Kierkegaard had a self-fulfilling way of being cursed. There was not only the matter of Rugine Olsen after he broke off his engagement. He spent the rest of his life tormented by her loss. There was also the Corsair affair of 1845 to 1846, when, after an unfavorable review, he wrote the following in dialectical result of a literary police action, with a paper like the Corsair, which hitherto has been read by many and all kinds of people and essentially has enjoyed the recognition of being ignored, despised, and never answered. The only thing to be done in writing in order to express the literary, moral order of things reflected in the inversion that this paper with meager competence and extreme effort has sought to bring about was for someone immortalized and praised in this paper to make application to be abused by the same paper. May I ask to be abused. The personal injury of being immortalized by the Corsair is just too much. And abused he was, in a campaign so bitingly satiric and mocking of all his personal weaknesses and defects. He was short and frail, and had been born with a hump on his back that he described himself as apprehensive of everyone with whom he came into contact, even the butcher boy. This was not self-indulgent paranoia, because Kierkegaard experienced the modern phenomenon of a celebrity degraded by the gutter press everywhere he walked in Copenhagen. It was a catastrophe for him because walking and talking to people in all stations of life had been his principal diversion.
What is deconstructionism?
Deconstructionism is a method for interpreting texts, the term for written works used by deconstructionists, that is based on the premise that the meaning of texts depends as much on the writer's background, historical conditions, and those of the reader, as it does on what is in the text itself.
What are some interesting facts about William James' life?
James was the oldest of 5 children. His brother Henry was the famous novelist, and his sister Alice became well known for her posthumous diaries. James' father, Henry James Sr., was both wealthy and eccentric. The James children were educated in the United States, England, and Europe, and William grew up with a cosmopolitan perspective. James was at first interested in studying art, but then turned to science. In youth he suffered from eye, back, stomach, and skin problems and was diagnosed as neurasthenic. He experienced depression and, at times, prolonged suicidal thoughts. While some of his ailments might be considered psychosomatic today, he did eventually die of heart failure. James began medical studies at Harvard in 1864 and took time off to travel on expeditions to the Amazon and to Germany for cures of various physical complaints. He was awarded his MD in 1869. It was his only academic degree, although he never practiced medicine. He married Alice Gibbons in 1878 and spent the remainder of his life teaching at Harvard. In both psychology and, after the early 1880s, philosophy. James' students included such luminaries as President Theodore Roosevelt, author and philosopher George Santayana, civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, philosopher Ralph Barton Perry, author Gertrude Stein, philosopher and legal scholar Morris Raphael Cohen, Alain Locke, sometimes called the father of the Harlem Renaissance, logician and pragmatist C.I. Lewis, and psychologist and philosopher Mary Calkins.
What kind of a materialist was Ludwig Feuerbach?
Feuerbach was an historical materialist. He sought to bring out the implicit Hegelian assumption that truth, reality, and sensibility are identical. But Feuerbach thought that by locating reason and consciousness in the absolute, Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, had alienated man's essence from him. He asserted that only a sensible being is a real, true being, and that thought is the product of this human being, and not the other way around. God or the Absolute is no more than the appearance of ourselves to ourselves. The work of philosophy was to begin with man, in his situation. Man was neither mere matter nor consciousness alone.
What did Martin Heidegger mean by ontology?
The term ontology refers to the study of being in a general sense that is relevant to all thinkers and theorists. Empiricists, for example, have ontologies in that there are some entities that they believe exist. According to Heidegger, ontology, as the first and last subject of philosophy, is the study of being, with a capital B. Being is existence itself, including everything that exists. But in particular human consciousness, for which being is first and foremost the condition of its own being. For readers who find this confusing, excellent relaxation can be found in Günter Grass' 1963 novel Dog Years, which contains a parody of Heidegger's terminology. In the literal description of a canine's wanderings during the Nazi era. For the more scholarly inclined, there is Theodore Adorno's The Jargon of Authenticity, 1973.
Who is Jerry Fodor?
Jerry Allen Fodor, 1935, a philosopher of cognitive science at Rutgers University. Is perhaps best known for his modular theory of mind and his concept of the Land gauge of thought. Fodor's books include, Psychological Explanation, 1968, The Language of Thought, 1975, Representations. Essays on the Foundations of Cognitive Science, 1979, The Modularity of Mind. An Essay on Faculty Psychology, 1983, Psychosemantics, The Problem of Meaning in the Philosophy of Mind, 1987. A Theory of Content and Other Essays, 1990, The Elm and the Expert, Mentalace and its Semantics, 1994. Concepts, Where Cognitive Science Went Wrong, 1998, In Critical Condition, 1998, The Mind Doesn't Work That Way. The Scope and Limits of Computational Psychology, 2000, and Hume Variations, 2003. Fodor also writes about opera for the London Review of Books. His writing style is uniquely witty and peppered with joyful mockery, as well as homespun analogies and references.
Why did the Pythagoreans avoid fava beans?
Many reasons have been given for why the Pythagoreans avoided fava beans. A belief that fava beans contain the souls of the dead, the resemblance of the seed in the bean to a human embryo, so that eating them would be like cannibalism. Fava beans seem to have the shape of testicles or the gates of hell. They evoke oligarchy or rule by wealth because they were commonly used to draw lots. And they allow part of the soul to escape in causing wind or gas. Fava beans were the only beans available in Europe before the discovery of the Americas. Modern research has shown that some Mediterranean populations are deficient in G6PD enzyme, and 1/5 of those with the deficiency suffer kidney damage if they eat fava beans. On the other hand, young fava beans contain levodopa, which in controlled doses can be an effective treatment for Parkinson's disease.
That is, should we say that the limits of reason are the limits of human knowledge? Or should we extend the limits of reason into the domain of religious faith and revelation?
Strictly speaking, these are questions of how we ought to think about religion. In the Middle Ages, which was the great age of religion, philosophers were constrained to begin their philosophizing with basic assumptions that God existed and that he was good. But philosophers have always been motivated to push through to the limits of knowledge and seek certainty within those limits. By deploying Aristotle as the personification of philosophy, Maimonides was able to raise necessarily covered questions of whether reason could justify belief in the existence and teachings not only of the Judaic version of God, but also of the Christian, and perhaps Muslim, God. We should remember that such questions, had they not been posed under the cover of the august and unquestionable authority of the philosopher himself, namely, Aristotle, would have resulted in loss of livelihood, excommunication, banishment or ostracism from the community of the devout and faithful, and also death itself. Philosophers were not stupid in the great age of religion. Notwithstanding their apparent devotion to varied theological regimes and their leaders, who it just so happened controlled all aspects of social, political, and economic life in Europe and the Middle East, at the same time that they upheld specific religious doctrines.
Is there interest in the Marquis de Sade today?
Yes. The Marquis de Sade has endured as a glamorous and enigmatic film subject. The 1969 film De Sade was shot in Germany, and speculation about who its director really was continues to the present time. In 1996, the Marquis was revisited in Dark Prince, which was not a blockbuster. The most recent reprise is the 2000 movie Quills, starring Geoffrey Rush as the Marquis, Kate Winslet as Madeline, a teenager with whom de Sade has an affair, Joaquin Phoenix as the Abbé du Calmeyer, and Michael Caine as Dr. Royer Collard. The setting of Quills is an insane asylum in Napoleonic France, where the Marquis has been confined because of his licentious, depraved ideas that he graphically expresses in writing. Even while incarcerated, he has been getting his manuscripts out to be published. Napoleon himself is disturbed by this travesty and sends Dr. Royer Collard, a mental health specialist, to deal with the Marquis and cure him. Dr. Royer Collard is a hypocrite who abuses his young wife. The film turns on the conflict between the Abbé and de Sade. The Abbé slowly goes mad, and the Marquis experiences remorse for the effect of his ideas on another. Overall, Quills is an aesthetically sophisticated film that dramatizes the continuously mordant wit of the Marquis de Sade, which coexisted with what would otherwise be unadorned pornography. In defying the optimism of the age of reason, he used its reigning weapon.
What was the analytic/synthetic distinction and why did C. I. Lewis need it?
Analytic truths are true by definition and tell us nothing about the world. Synthetic truths are about the world, but they can turn out to be false. Along with this distinction is the a priori/a posteriori distinction. A priori knowledge is known without, or before, experience, whereas a posteriori knowledge can only be known after, or as a result of, experience. Empiricist philosophers traditionally hold that there are no a priori synthetic truths, and they have tended to assume that what is analytic is also a priori, and what is synthetic is a posteriori. Lewis' main philosophical tool, in accounting for both ordinary experience and scientific knowledge, was to distinguish between the a priori and what he called the given. Quite simply, he thought that our knowledge and experience was the result of the interplay between the a priori and the given. There is something brute in our experience that we have no control over. But we make sense of it by projecting a priori principles and categories onto it.
Who was Edmund Husserl?
Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938, is recognized as the founder of phenomenology as a systematic method of philosophy. He also created an important and new perspective on logic and mathematics, which distinguished them from empirically discovered psychological rules of thought. Husserl's major works are Logical Investigations, 1900, The Idea of Phenomenology, 1907, and Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Investigation, 1913.
What was Vico's cyclical idea of history?
Vico believed that there are cultural patterns that dominate in different societies. Thus, law, religion, politics, art, and manners all tend to match up at any given time and place. For example, he drew connections between Athenian law and its pre-Socratic and Socratic philosophies. In his cyclical account of history, or what he called corsi e ricorsi, societies organically develop and then age and rot. He posited a bestial condition, a time of the gods, and a time of heroes, which also leads to oligarchies, or rule by the richest. This is followed by an age of men, characterized by class conflict, until the society decays. Vico applied this theory to the history of Rome, beginning with the mythical founders Romulus and Remus and ending with its overthrow by external barbarians.
What is truth-functional logic?
Truth-functional logic preserves logical truth by substituting terms according to the rules of logic. The truth or falsity of a statement can be calculated according to the truth of its parts. For example, if A or not A, the law of non-contradiction, is a rule. Then if A is true, not A must be false, if A is false, then not A must be true. Compound sentences are true or false depending only on whether their components are true or false. For example, the sentence "it is raining and cold" is true if "it is raining" is true and "it is cold" is true. Truth-functional logic is typically applied according to tables that indicate the truth values of sentences that contain clauses linked by the connectives if, and, not, if then, and if and only if. The truth or falsity of the whole sentence depends on the truth or falsity of its components. according to the rules of logic that apply to each of the connectives.
What is the story about Karl Popper and Ludwig Wittgenstein's poker?
Witnesses disagree, but the most neutral account is that there was a meeting of the Moral Sciences Club in room H3 at King's College, Cambridge, on October 25, 1946. Bertrand Russell 1872–1970, presided, and Karl Popper, 1902–1994, came to give a critical paper on Ludwig Wittgenstein's 1889–1951, Language Game Theory of Truth and How to Do Philosophy. For one thing, Popper thought that there were moral rules. At some point, Wittgenstein picked up a poker from the fireplace. He either did this to make a point or out of anger, stories differ. When Wittgenstein asked Popper what the example of a moral rule was, Popper is said to have replied, not to threaten visiting lecturers with pokers. Bertrand Russell, who was by then alienated from Wittgenstein, may or may not have interceded and told them to calm down. A very entertaining book has been written about this episode and the lives and times of Popper and Wittgenstein by British Broadcasting Corporation. Journalists David Edmonds and John I. Denow, Wittgenstein's Poker, 2001. Popper's notion of falsification required that one falsifying instance either lead to the rejection of the original hypothesis, or more likely, to a re-examination of initial conditions. For example, if the hypothesis is that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and a body of water does not freeze at that temperature, the rule or hypothesis that water freezes at that temperature is unlikely to be discarded. Rather, the thermometer may need to be checked, as well as the chemical composition of the liquid presumed to be water.
What were Plato's dialogues?
Plato's surviving written works span a period of about 50 years. He wrote in the form of elegant, dramatic, and poetic dialogues, which scholars usually divide into different periods: the Apology, Charmides, Crito, Eupyphro, Hippias Minor, Ion, Laches, and Protagoras, taken alphabetically, are considered his early works. The middle works are the Phaedo, Symposium, Republic, and Phaedrus, believed to have been written in that order. And these were followed by later works of the Sophist, Statesman, and Philebus. Plato's Timaeus may fall somewhere either in the middle or late writings. His letters, numbered I through 13, were written toward the end of his life. Only letters 3, 7, 8, and 13 are unquestionably genuine, as is his will. There were no printing presses in Plato's day and no bookstores or libraries in Athens at the time he wrote. His dialogues probably reached their audiences through oral performances. and it is likely that Plato himself enacted the role of Socrates.
Who was Maurice Merleau-Ponty?
Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1908–1961. Was an anti-empiricist who sought to reconstruct the world based on a phenomenology of human perception. He was influenced by Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938, was friends with Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905–1980, for a while, and continues to be of great interest to phenomenological philosophers of mind. His principal works are The Phenomenology of Perception, 1945. Numerous essays, and his unfinished The Visible and the Invisible.
What is existentialism?
Existentialism is a kind of philosophy that begins from the concrete reality of the human individual's existence in the world. What is shared by all humans in their day-to-day life becomes a foundation for knowledge and the nature of reality. Existentialism is focused on human experience from the first person, some me or I.
Who was Themistocles?
According to some accounts, Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, the pre-Socratic who founded a brotherhood based on the religious idea that everything is made up of numbers, was taught his ethical beliefs by Themistocles. c. 524 to 459 BCE, the priestess of Delphi. It is known that Apollo was both the god at the temple of Delphi and a deity worshipped by Pythagoreans. Pythagoras and his followers practiced self-examination and dietary and ritualistic purification, including their vegetarianism, based on a belief in the sameness of all life. This principle of sameness might have implied that women should be included in philosophical activities.
Who is Ruth Barkin Marcus?
Ruth Barkin Marcus, 1921, was educated at Yale, received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1952, and was a founding chair of the philosophy department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. After working as a professor at Northwestern University, she was Halleck Professor of Philosophy at Yale University from 1973 to 1991. She worked in the formal subjects of quantification theory and modal logic, sometimes in disagreement with W. V. O'Quine, 1908 to 2000. One of her most striking achievements was an early formulation of the new causal theory of reference, made famous by Hilary Putnam, 1926, and Saul Kripke, 1940. The causal theory of reference held that words for things have a history from the first time someone used a specific word to stand for a specific object or idea. For example, we call apples apples because that word was the first at some time, in some specific place, to be used to name the fruit. As proponents of the causal theory of reference put it, apples were baptized apples. Marcus' groundbreaking journal articles are collected in Modalities, Philosophical Essays, 1993. She received the American Philosophical Association Quinn Prize for service to the profession in 2007.
What makes the concerns of these historically disadvantaged groups part of philosophy?
When philosophers take up these concerns, as many have in recent decades, they become part of the official curriculum of philosophy in higher education. In addition, the issues raised require the methods of both analytic and continental philosophy to resolve. Some of these issues are ethical and others are directly related to political philosophy and public policy, both of which are now part of the canon of contemporary philosophy.
Who was Jules-Henri Poincaré?
Jules-Henri Poincaré, 1854–1912, was a mathematician, physicist, and philosopher of science. He responded to the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry by suggesting a modification of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804, claim that we have synthetic a priori knowledge of the world, that is, certainly true knowledge that applies to reality, which is not based on experience. His proposal was what became known as conventionalism, namely that physicists will retain Euclidean geometry because it has the simplest geometrical conventions and is therefore appropriate for them. This proposal was short-lived in mathematics, because Albert Einstein was to show in his general theory of relativity that the curvature of space obeyed the principles of non-Euclidean geometry. However, the broader principle of conventionalism, namely that truth in science depends on agreement about specified rules, was to be revived as an idea of scientific truth in the 20th century.
What have been the two main subjects of Western philosophy?
Western philosophy has always had two main subjects, the natural world and the human world. The natural world includes nature, physical reality, and the cosmos. The human world includes human beings, their values, experience, minds, ethics, societies, government, cultures, and human nature itself. Philosophy of course occurs in all cultures and daily life. But Western philosophy is a distinct way of thinking that consists of hypotheses and generalizations about what philosophers believe is important in the natural and human worlds. Western philosophers have not been focused on stories of the origins of peoples nor on events in time, like historians, and neither are they focused on individual lives, like biographers. Instead, they have sought to view events and lives in general and abstract ways that can tell us what is true of categories or kinds of events, and individual lives.
Who were the encyclopedists?
They were scholars who attempted to systematically present all of human knowledge at their time. Chief among them were Boethius, 480 c. 525, of Italy, whose work went far beyond the alphabetized. Speculations of the other two who best represented this period, St. Isidore of Seville, 560 to 636, and the Venerable Bede of Britain, 674 to 735. Both Isidore and the Bede were clerics who devoted their lives to ecclesiastical service. Isidore compiled Etymologia, or Origins, which was a systematic presentation of all available learning during his time and endured as a textbook in church schools for hundreds of years. The Venerable Bede was best known for his histories, particularly that of Britain. The next real philosophical luminary was Johannes Scotus Eriugena, c. 815 to 877.